Welcome to the channel Stories of Slavery. Today's story takes us to Mississippi 1871 and the bizarre mystery of a black girl people called a witch because no one could explain what happened around her. This is a difficult and intense story rooted in cruelty, fear, and racism. So, take a moment, breathe, and listen carefully. Before we begin, subscribe and write in the comments which city and country you're listening from. Your participation helps keep these stories remembered instead of buried. Let's begin. They found her kneeling in the mud at dawn, hands covered in blood that wasn't hers, whispering words no white man had ever heard. The year was 1871. The place was Wilkinson County, Mississippi, and the girl they would come to call a witch was barely 17 years old. Her name was Abigail Collins. The Collins part came from somewhere lost to history. Maybe a former owner, maybe a name her mother chose when freedom came. It didn't matter much. In that corner of the world, black people's names were written in dust, easily blown away and forgotten. But Abigail's name would be remembered, feared, whispered in the dark when children got sick and hope ran thin. The morning they discovered her power, old Thomas Grebs lay dying in a slave cabin that still stood 6 years after the war supposedly ended freedom. Dysentery had hollowed him out for 3 weeks. His wife had stopped crying 2 days prior, accepting what everyone knew. Black folks didn't survive dysentery in Mississippi, not without doctors. And doctors didn't come for black folks, but Abigail came. She appeared at the cabin door before sunrise carrying a cloth bundle that smelled like earth and something bitter. Nobody had sent for her. Nobody knew how she knew Thomas was dying. She was just there, like she'd walked straight out of the morning fog that clung to the Mississippi bottomlands. Thomas's wife backed away when she saw the girl, fear sharper than grief in her voice as she tried to ward her off. The other neighbors who'd come to pay respects pressed themselves against the cabin walls, torn between wanting to run and needing to see what would happen next. Everyone knew about Abigail Collins. Everyone had heard the stories, and everyone was terrified of what she represented. Abigail didn't acknowledge their fear. She never did. She simply walked past them all, knelt beside Thomas, and began to work. Her hands moved with purpose that seemed impossible for someone her age. She crushed leaves between her palms, mixed them with water from a clay jar she'd brought, and poured the mixture between Thomas's cracked lips. She pressed her fingers against his swollen belly, feeling for something the rest of them couldn't see. And then she began to speak. The words weren't English. They weren't anything the people gathered could identify. Some said later it sounded like the old language, the one their grandparents brought from Africa in the bellies of ships. Others swore it was something else entirely, something that made their skin prickle and their hearts beat faster. The sound seemed to come from somewhere deeper than her throat, resonating in the small cabin like a physical presence. Thomas's wife made the sign of the cross, whispering prayers that competed with whatever Abigail was saying. The atmosphere in the room grew thick, heavy, as if the air itself had become substance. Candles flickered, though there was no breeze. The temperature seemed to drop despite the Mississippi heat pressing against the walls outside. For 20 minutes, Abigail worked in silence, broken only by her strange words. Her fingers traced patterns on Thomas's chest, symbols that left no visible mark, but seemed to glow faintly in the dim light. She placed heated stones wrapped in cloth along his sides, positioning them with geometric precision. She made him drink 3 different mixtures, each one darker and more foul-smelling than the last. Each one administered with the confidence of someone who knew exactly what she was doing and why. Then she stood up, wiped her bloody hands on her dress, and walked out without a word. Thomas Grebs was sitting up by noon asking for food. By evening, he was walking. Within 3 days, he was back in the fields, weak but alive. The impossible had happened, and everyone knew who'd done it. That's when the whispers started. That's when Abigail Collins became something more than a girl. She became a problem that needed solving. Wilkinson County in 1871 was a place caught between 2 worlds, neither of them kind. The war had ended 6 years earlier, but you wouldn't know it by looking around. The same white families who'd owned plantations still controlled the land. The same black families who worked as slaves still worked the same fields, now as sharecroppers, drowning in debt they could never repay. Freedom had come with papers and promises, but the reality felt remarkably like chains with different names. The county sat in the southwestern corner of Mississippi, where the land was rich and black and perfect for cotton. The population was about 70% black, roughly 4,000 souls compared to 2,000 white residents. but power remained entirely in white hands. Violence hung in the air like humidity, constant and oppressive. The Ku Klux Klan rode openly on Saturday nights, their white sheets visible from miles away. Black men disappeared with disturbing regularity. Black women were violated with impunity, their attackers protected by laws that didn't recognize them as fully human, and black children learned early that survival meant making yourself small, quiet, invisible. Abigail Collins had never learned that lesson. She couldn't. It wasn't in her nature. She lived alone in the shack near the cypress swamps about 2 miles from the nearest sharecropper community. The structure was barely standing with gaps in the walls that let in wind and rain, a roof that leaked in a dozen places, and a dirt floor that turned to mud when it stormed. But it was hers, and that mattered more than comfort. Her mother had died of fever when Abigail was 12, burning up in 3 days. While no doctor came and no medicine helped, her father had been sold away before she was born. Back when selling humans was legal and called business instead of evil, she'd been raised partially by an old woman named Mama Zena, a root worker who kept the traditional healing knowledge alive through slavery and into this uncertain freedom. Mama Zena had been ancient, even when Abigail was small, her face carved with wrinkles deep as river valleys, her hands gnarled but sure. She'd survived 60 years of bondage, outlived 3 owners, and accumulated knowledge that white doctors would have paid fortunes to possess if their pride had allowed them to learn from a black woman. Mama Zena died when Abigail was 15, but not before teaching her everything: how to identify healing plants by touch in total darkness, running fingers along leaves and stems until the right one revealed itself, which roots stopped bleeding and which ones stopped hearts, a distinction that could mean life or death depending on the situation. How to set bones so they healed straight instead of crooked, how to bring down fevers that should have been fatal, how to brew teas that prevented pregnancy and tinctures that ended it, knowledge that gave women power over their own bodies in a world determined to take that power away. She taught Abigail how to pray in the old way, calling on powers that had crossed the ocean in the minds of stolen people, because powers can't be chained even when bodies are. She'd shown her how to listen to the body's own wisdom, how to feel what was wrong before seeing it, how to understand that healing wasn't just about herbs and prayers, but about the connection between physical and spiritual, between individual and community, between past and present. Abigail had learned it all, absorbed it like the black earth absorbed rain, and she'd added something of her own, something Mama Zena recognized but couldn't quite explain. The girl had a gift that went beyond knowledge. She possessed intuition that bordered on seeing, an ability to know what was wrong with a body before touching it, to sense sickness in people before symptoms appeared. She had a presence that made people uneasy even as they sought her help, an intensity in her dark eyes that suggested she saw more than what was visible. By 17, Abigail had been healing people for 2 years. Ever since Mama Zena's hands got too shaky and her eyes too dim to work effectively, she'd started in secret, only treating people who came to her shack after dark, people desperate enough to risk being seen visiting someone the community already feared. Word spread slowly at first, then faster as the impossible became undeniable. A child's fever broken in a single night when 3 days of prayer had done nothing. A man's infected wound healed without amputation when white doctors had already sharpened their sores. A woman's bleeding stopped when she should have bled to death after childbirth. Her life saved by hands that knew exactly where to press and what herbs to use. Each miracle added to Abigail's reputation, and each miracle made her more dangerous in the eyes of those who needed black people to remain powerless. The white population of Wilkinson County had tolerated root workers before. Old slave women who knew herbs were useful, even necessary, when white doctors were scarce and expensive and often ineffective. But those women had been careful. They'd been humble. They'd acted grateful for the chance to serve. They'd bowed their heads and stepped aside and never ever challenged the natural order that kept them at the bottom of every hierarchy. Abigail Collins knew no such thing. She didn't bow her head when white people passed. She didn't step off the road to let them by. She looked them in the eye, which was its own form of revolution in Mississippi in 1871. And she possessed knowledge that gave her power. Real power. The kind that couldn't be legislated away or burned down or beaten out of someone. The kind of power that threatened the very foundation of a society built on the assumption of black inferiority. That made her intolerable. That made her a threat that needed to be eliminated. The first time Sheriff James Cutler heard about Abigail, he was sitting in the Woodville courthouse listening to Edmund Hartwell complain. Hartwell owned 3,000 acres of prime cotton land and the debt of 40 black families who worked it. He was 62 years old, lean and hard as cypress wood, with cold blue eyes and a mouth that rarely smiled. He'd been born into wealth, raised to believe that his prosperity was divinely ordained, and the war had shaken his faith in nothing except the Yankees who'd won it. Hartwell explained his problem with the careful precision of a man used to having his concerns taken seriously. There was a Negro girl practicing witchcraft. She was keeping workers alive who should have died from disease or injury. She was healing people so effectively that the black population was starting to see her as some kind of prophet or priestess. They were getting ideas. They were starting to believe they didn't need white authority for everything. They were beginning to think they had value independent of their labor. Sheriff Cutler understood immediately. He was 38, born in Wilkinson County, raised on stories about how good things were before Yankees and black freedom destroyed the natural order. He'd ridden with irregular Confederate forces during the war, which was a polite way of saying he'd terrorized Union sympathizers and murdered freed slaves who'd gotten too confident about their new status. He wore a badge now, but his methods hadn't changed much. Violence was still his primary tool, just applied more selectively and with legal justification. Black people with hope were dangerous. Black people who believed they had power were more dangerous still, and a black girl who could demonstrate actual power, who could save lives when white authority said those lives were forfeit, that was the most dangerous thing of all. It undermined everything. It suggested that maybe white supremacy wasn't natural or inevitable, that maybe black people possessed abilities and knowledge that made them equal or even superior in certain domains. That suggestion, if allowed to spread, could unravel the entire social fabric. Cutler promised to handle it. That same evening, he rode out to Abigail's shack with 2 deputies, men who'd also worn gray during the war, and white sheets after it. They found the place easily enough. Smoke rose from the crew chimney. A small garden grew beside the shack, neat rows of plants none of them could identify. Bundles of drying herbs hung from the porch roof, filling the air with unfamiliar scents. They dismounted 20 yards away, hands on their pistols. The door opened before they could announce themselves. Abigail stepped out, and for a moment, all 3 men froze. She wasn't what they'd expected. The word witch had conjured images of something old and ugly, bent and frightening, more monster than human. But Abigail was young, with smooth, dark skin that caught the last light of evening and eyes that held no fear whatsoever. She was tall for a girl, nearly 5'8", with her hair wrapped in a blue cloth. She wore a simple dress, patched but clean, and she regarded the 3 armed white men the way someone might regard stray dogs that had wandered into their yard. Cutler announced his purpose. They'd had complaints. Folks saying she was practicing medicine without license, engaging in hoodoo and conjuring, stirring up trouble among the Negro population. That was illegal in Mississippi. She needed to come with them, shut this operation down, except that certain things weren't for black people to do. Abigail's response was simple and devastating. She told Cutler, no, just that. No explanation, no apology, no attempt to negotiate, just a flat refusal that hung in the air like a challenge no one had expected. The confrontation escalated quickly. Cutler drew his weapon, pointing it at her chest, his authority challenged in a way that made him feel small and angry. He announced her arrest. He threatened to shoot her where she stood if she resisted. He used every tool of intimidation he'd developed over years of keeping black people in line. And then Abigail did something that changed everything. She looked at the gun, then back at Cutler's face, and she spoke with quiet certainty about his son. She knew the boy was sick. She knew he'd been suffering for 2 weeks with a fever that came and went. She knew Cutler's wife had been praying while Cutler tried to hide his fear. She described symptoms she shouldn't have known about, details that were private, medical information that was supposed to be secret. Then she delivered her diagnosis. Malaria. The fever would keep coming back, getting worse each time until it took the boy. Maybe a month from now, maybe 2, but it would take him unless someone who knew what they were doing intervened. The words hit Cutler like physical blows. His son was sick, had been for exactly 2 weeks, with exactly the symptoms she'd described. His wife Margaret had been beside herself with worry. The doctor had said it was just a fever, nothing serious. But it kept coming back, and each time the boy seemed weaker. Cutler had been losing sleep, watching his son burn at night, feeling helpless in a way that terrified him. In a way that terrified him. Abigail gave him a choice. He could arrest her tonight, drag her to jail, maybe hang her if he got a judge drunk enough to ignore basic law, but his boy would still die. Or he could leave her alone, let her do what she did, and maybe she'd consider helping when he came begging, which he would. They always did. For a long moment, nobody moved. The deputies looked at Cutler, waiting for orders. Cutler stared at Abigail, rage and fear fighting in his eyes. Everything in him wanted to shoot her right there to eliminate this threat to the natural order, to prove that black people couldn't challenge white authority without consequences. But his son was dying. That was more real than pride or racial hierarchy, or the rules he'd spent his life enforcing. He holstered his weapon and rode away, leaving Abigail standing on her porch, watching them disappear into the gathering darkness. She'd won that round, but she knew it wouldn't be the last. Men like Cutler didn't forget humiliation, and white Mississippi didn't tolerate black people who refused to submit, especially not black women, especially not young ones who demonstrated power that threatened the very foundation of white supremacy. The next challenge came from a different direction, one that claimed moral authority instead of legal force. Reverend Samuel Marsh ran the Woodville Methodist Church, a white clapboard building that stood at the center of town like a moral compass that only pointed one way. Marsh was 54, silver-haired, possessed of a booming voice. He used to deliver sermons about God's natural order and the sin of racial mixing. He'd supported slavery from the pulpit, calling it biblical and ordained. He'd opposed Reconstruction, calling it satanic interference with divine will. And when he heard about a black girl claiming powers that seemed to rival divine intervention, he saw a theological threat that needed to be addressed from the pulpit. On Sunday, May 14, 1871, Reverend Marsh delivered a sermon specifically about Abigail. Though he never used her name, he spoke about Exodus 7:1, where Pharaoh's magicians used secret arts to replicate Moses' miracles. He spoke about Acts 8, where Simon the sorcerer amazed people with magic before Peter rebuked him. He spoke about Deuteronomy 18:10, which forbade anyone who practiced divination or sorcery or interpreted omens. His voice filled the church, bouncing off wooden walls and settling into the hearts of people who wanted simple answers to complicated questions. There was among them, he thundered, a practitioner of dark arts, who claimed powers of healing, who used potions and incantations, who led the colored population astray with false miracles that seemed real but came from Satan himself. This was not medicine. This was not godly. This was witchcraft, plain and simple, and it had to be stopped before it corrupted more souls. His congregation nodded in murmured agreement. After the service, groups of men gathered outside discussing what should be done. Some argued for legal action through proper channels. Others suggested more direct methods, the kind that happened at night with torches and ropes. All agreed that Abigail Collins represented a problem that needed solving before she became more powerful, before more black people started believing they could challenge white authority through any means, even healing. Word of the sermon reached Abigail through Marcus Webb, a young black man who worked as a stable hand in Woodville. He'd heard the sermon secondhand from his employer and rode out to warn her that same afternoon, his horse third with sweat from the hard ride. He stood nervous on her porch, glancing around as if Reverend Marsh might appear at any moment. Abigail was grinding roots with a mortar and pestle, preparing medicine for a child with CRO. She listened to Marcus's warning without stopping her work, her hands moving with steady rhythm. When he finished, she made a simple observation. Reverend Marsh could say what he wanted. She wasn't hurting anybody. She was helping people. His God didn't care enough to help. People who died while Christians prayed over them with no effect whatsoever. Marcus left and Abigail continued her work. But something had shifted. The opposition to her was organizing, taking shape, becoming systematic. It wasn't just one angry sheriff or one frightened family anymore. It was becoming official. The kind of threat that ended with trees and ropes and crowds that called themselves righteous while committing murder. She knew what was coming. She'd always known, really. From the moment she'd started using Mama Zena's knowledge openly, she'd understood that power in black hands was intolerable to white Mississippi. The only question had been timing. How long before they moved from fear to action? How long before someone decided she needed to be eliminated? The answer came sooner than expected. That night around midnight, Abigail heard footsteps outside. Multiple people trying to move quietly but failing because fear makes people clumsy. She blew out her candle and moved to the window, peering through a crack in the boards. 6 men surrounded her shack, all wearing white sheets that glowed in the moonlight. Klansmen. They carried torches that threw dancing shadows and rifles that promised violence. One of them, bigger than the others, and clearly the leader, stepped forward and shouted demands. Abigail Collins needed to come out. They knew what she was. They knew what she'd been doing. Time to answer for her witchcraft. Time to leave the county or face consequences that would make her regret every life she'd saved. Abigail had prepared for this possibility. Every root worker who lived long enough learned to prepare for violence. The shack had a back door that led directly into the swamp, a route she practiced running in darkness until she could do it blind. She had supplies hidden in 3 different locations in the swamp, enough to survive for weeks if necessary. She had allies among the black community who would hide her if needed, though helping her would put them at risk too. But she also had something else, something she'd inherited from Mama and refined through practice and necessity. A gift that went beyond herbs and prayers. An ability that she didn't fully understand, but had learned to trust. Something that happened when fear and belief and intention combined in ways that defied rational explanation. She opened the door and stepped out onto the porch, facing the masked men directly. Her courage in that moment was either magnificent or insane, depending on perspective. She stood there alone and unarmed, facing 6 men with weapons and murder in their hearts, and she showed no fear at all. The big Klansman seemed taken back by her boldness. He repeated his demands. She needed to leave. Tonight they'd give her one chance. She could run or she could burn. Those were the only options they were offering. Abigail's response was measured and direct. If she left, who would heal the people she'd been healing? Who would save the children dying from fever? Who would stop the bleeding when women gave birth? Would these men do it? Would Reverend Marsh put down his Bible and set broken bones? Would Sheriff Cutler use his gun to cure dysentery? The Klansmen said that wasn't their concern. Black people had survived before she came along, and they'd survive after she was gone. What mattered was that a Negro girl couldn't have this kind of power, couldn't demonstrate this kind of ability, couldn't prove that white supremacy was a lie built on the suppression of black knowledge and skill. Then something happened that no one could explain, least of all Abigail herself. One of the Klansmen suddenly cried out, clutching at his chest. His rifle fell from his hands. He tried to speak but couldn't get air into his lungs. He fell to his knees, gasping like a fish pulled from water. Then another Klansman cried out, dropping his torch, his hands shaking uncontrollably. Then a third collapsed entirely, his body seizing. The big Klansman demanded to know what Abigail was doing to them. She answered honestly, nothing. She was standing there talking. She hadn't touched anyone. She hadn't given them anything. She'd simply stood her ground and refused to be intimidated. But perhaps, she suggested, there were powers in this world that didn't appreciate men hiding their faces and threatening girls in the night. Perhaps their own guilt was manifesting physically. Perhaps the universe itself had opinions about injustice and sometimes expressed those opinions in ways that looked like intervention. 4 of the 6 Klansmen were now on the ground, writhing or unconscious. The remaining 2, including the big one, backed away slowly, terror replacing their earlier confidence. The big man whispered that she was a witch, saying it like an accusation and a revelation. Abigail neither confirmed nor denied it. She simply told them to get off her property, take their friends, and deliver a message. She wasn't leaving. She wasn't hiding. And the next time someone came here, meaning harm, they might not leave at all. The 2 standing Klansmen grabbed their fallen companions and dragged them away, disappearing into the darkness like ghosts fleeing dawn. Abigail watched until she couldn't see their torches anymore, then went back inside, her hands shaking now that the danger had passed. What had just happened? She didn't know. She hadn't consciously done anything to those men. She hadn't poisoned them or cast a spell or used any technique Mama Zena had taught her, but they'd fallen anyway, struck down by something invisible and undeniable. But Mama had warned her about moments like this. Times when the gift manifested in ways beyond conscious control. Times when belief and fear and something older than both combined to create effects that looked like magic, because nobody had better words for them. Times when the boundary between physical and spiritual became thin enough that intention alone could shape reality. It happened sometimes among people with the gift, slaves who'd cursed their masters and watched those masters fall ill with no apparent cause, rude workers who protected their communities through means that couldn't be explained or replicated, healers whose presence alone seemed to determine who lived and died. The gift was real, but it operated according to rules that Western science didn't acknowledge and couldn't measure. Abigail didn't sleep that night. She sat by her window, watching for more visitors, but none came. By dawn, she knew the story would spread. The clan had tried to drive her out and failed. Men had fallen at her feet without her touching them. The legend would grow, and with it, both her protection and her danger. She was right. By noon the next day, every black person in 20 Mi had heard some version of what happened. The details got exaggerated with each telling, as stories do. Some said she'd killed all 6 Klansmen. Others claimed she'd turned them into animals. A few swore she'd made them disappear entirely. The truth was strange enough without embellishment, but people added to it anyway because sometimes legends protect better than facts. A witch who could strike men down with a look was more useful than a girl who'd gotten lucky. The white community heard different versions, equally distorted. Sheriff Cutler received reports that Abigail had attacked 6 upstanding citizens with dark magic. Reverend Marsh heard she'd summoned demons. Edmund Hartwell heard she'd cursed half the county. None of them knew exactly what to do with a problem that resisted both legal authority and physical intimidation. You couldn't arrest someone for being frightening. You couldn't hang someone for making men fall down without touching them. For 2 weeks, an uneasy standoff held. Abigail continued her work, treating people who came to her in increasing numbers. The failed Klan raid had paradoxically increased her credibility. If she could protect herself from armed white men, surely she could protect those who sought her help. The white establishment continued plotting, looking for a way to eliminate her that wouldn't make them look weak or frightened or unable to control their own county, and the black community watched anxiously, knowing that whatever happened to Abigail would affect them all. She'd become a symbol, whether she wanted to be or not. Her survival meant hope was possible. Her destruction would prove that hope was foolish. The breaking point came from an unexpected source. Thomas Grieve, the old man Abigail had saved from dysentery, made a mistake born of gratitude and relief. He'd been so happy to be alive, so grateful for his healing that he talked about it openly. He praised Abigail's skill while working in Edmund Hartwell's cotton field within earshot of Hartwell's overseer. He called her blessed by God, said she had powers that went beyond human understanding, suggested that maybe black people had knowledge white people didn't possess. The overseer reported it to Hartwell immediately. Hartwell saw an opportunity. Public testimony from a black man about Abigail's powers could be used as evidence, and if that black man had been healed through witchcraft, well, that made him a victim instead of a supporter. It gave them the legal hook they needed. On May 29, 1871, Edmund Hartwell filed formal charges against Abigail Collins with the Wilkinson County Court. The charges were deliberately vague, but legally sufficient. Practicing medicine without a license, engaging in witchcraft, inciting unrest among the Negro population, and making terroristic threats against white citizens. The penalty, if convicted, could range anywhere from a fine she couldn't possibly pay to hanging. The vagueness was intentional. It gave Judge William Morrison flexibility to determine the sentence based on political considerations rather than legal precedent. A warrant was issued. Sheriff Cutler was ordered to arrest Abigail and bring her before Judge Morrison for trial. This time Cutler brought 8 men, all deputies, all armed with both rifles and determination. This time he came during daylight when there'd be witnesses to everything that happened and no room for mysterious events that people could later question or distort. They found Abigail working in her garden, pulling weeds from around her medicinal plants. She saw them coming and stood slowly, dirt on her hands, facing them with the same calm she'd shown the Klansmen. She knew what this meant. Arrest, trial, almost certain conviction, possibly death. Cutler delivered his message formally. She was under arrest. She would remain silent or speak, her choice. But she was coming with them to stand trial. The charges would be read in court. She'd have an opportunity to defend herself, though they both knew that was theater. The outcome was predetermined. Abigail asked what charges justified 8 armed men to arrest 1 unarmed girl. Cutler said she'd find out soon enough. She could walk peacefully or be dragged, but she was leaving her shack either way. The time for warnings had passed. Now came consequences. She considered her options quickly. She could run. The swamp was close. She knew paths they didn't. But running would confirm guilt in everyone's eyes. It would make her a fugitive. It would mean abandoning everyone who depended on her. And it would prove that white authority could still control black people through fear. So, she agreed to come, but with a simple statement that needed to be said and witnessed. She hadn't done anything wrong, and Cutler knew it. Everyone there knew it. She'd healed people. She'd saved lives. That was her only crime. And if they wanted to hang her for it, they'd have to live with what that said about them. They bound her hands, unnecessary and deliberately humiliating. They walked her through the main road of Woodville, making sure people saw her captured, making sure everyone understood that black power, no matter how real or beneficial, would not be tolerated. Black people watched from doorways and windows, their faces showing anguish and fear and helpless rage. White people gathered on porches, some looking satisfied, others uncertain, a few clearly uncomfortable with what was happening. And Abigail walked between them all, her head high, her dignity intact despite the ropes, showing everyone that you could bind someone's hands without binding their spirit. They locked her in a cell in the courthouse basement, a small space with a dirt floor and no windows. The trial was scheduled for June 5th, 1 week away. 7 days to sit in darkness while her enemies built a case designed to destroy her. 7 days for fear to work its way into her bones and make her small and apologetic and willing to accept whatever mercy they offered. But Abigail wasn't alone, even in that cell. Word of her arrest spread immediately through the black community. People began gathering money for a lawyer, though finding one willing to defend a black woman against witchcraft charges in Mississippi in 1871 would be nearly impossible. Others brought food, bribing guards to pass it to her. And every night, groups of black people gathered outside the courthouse, singing spirituals, praying, maintaining a vigil that said even if the Lord didn't protect Abigail, her community wouldn't abandon her. Inside her cell, Abigail sat in darkness and considered her situation with the clear-eyed assessment of someone who'd always known this moment would come. The trial was a formality. Judge Morrison would find her guilty because that's what men like Hartwell and Marsh expected, and Morrison owed his position to men like them. The only real question was the sentence. If they just wanted her gone, they might offer exile, banishment from Mississippi with the threat of death if she returned. If they wanted to make an example to send a message to every black person in the county that certain lines must not be crossed, they'd hang her in the town square. She thought about everything Mama Zena had taught her, about knowledge passed down through generations of enslaved people, kept alive when everything else was stolen, about the power that came from understanding the body, the earth, the connection between physical and spiritual, about the responsibility that came with possessing that power. Mama Zena had said something near the end of her life that Abigail remembered now. Don't waste the gift on people who'd sooner see you dead than admit you're right. But don't hoard it either. Power that's kept hidden might as well not exist. You use it when it matters. Consequences be damned. You use it to help your people, and if they kill you for it, well, at least you'll die having made a difference. Abigail had used her gift. She'd saved lives. She'd stood up to authority. She'd refused to be small and quiet and invisible, and now she'd pay whatever price that required unless something changed, unless the universe had other plans. On the 5th night of her imprisonment, a guard came to her cell around midnight carrying a lantern that pushed back the absolute darkness. He was young, maybe 25, with nervous eyes and hands that shook slightly as he unlocked the door. He whispered that she had a visitor, someone who'd paid good money for 10 minutes of privacy, but they couldn't get her out. If he opened that cell and she escaped, his life was over. Abigail said she understood. Then Sheriff James Cutler stepped into the light and everything shifted again. Part 2. Cutler stood in the dim light of her cell, looking older than he had during their first confrontation. The confidence that usually armored him had worn thin. Deep circles shadowed his eyes. His shoulders sagged under the weight of something heavier than the badge pinned to his chest. He got straight to the point. His son was dying. The malaria had come back worse, just as Abigail had predicted. The fever spiked higher each time. The boy couldn't keep food down. The doctor had stopped coming, said there was nothing more to be done except pray and prepare. But Cutler didn't believe in prayer anymore, not after watching his 9-year-old son waste away while God stayed silent. He needed her help. He was willing to make a deal. Abigail listened without interrupting. This was the moment she predicted, the inevitable conclusion when white supremacy collided with the reality of a sick child. Ideology meant nothing when your son was dying. Pride became negotiable. Even racial hatred could be temporarily suspended when death came knocking. Cutler explained his offer carefully. He couldn't free her. Too many people were watching. If she simply disappeared, there would be questions, accusations, possibly riots. The white establishment needed their trial, needed their moment of public dominance, but he could influence the outcome. Judge Morrison owed him favors accumulated over years of cooperation. He could convince Morrison to sentence her to exile instead of hanging, She'd be escorted to the county line, released with the warning never to return to Mississippi, but she'd be alive. All she had to do was save his son first. Abigail considered the proposal in silence. Exile meant losing everything. Her home, her community, everyone she'd been helping. It meant starting over with nothing in a place where she knew no one and her reputation couldn't protect her. But it was better than hanging, better than giving white Mississippi the satisfaction of killing her publicly, making her death a warning to every other black person who dared to challenge the established order, and refusing to help a dying child violated everything Mama Zena had taught her. The gift wasn't conditional. It didn't depend on whether someone deserved healing or whether their family had treated you justly. You help because you could, because the alternative was letting someone die when you possessed the knowledge to save them. She agreed. The guard led her out through a back entrance, moving quietly through Woodville's empty streets while the town slept. Cutler's house stood on the edge of town, a modest two-story structure that spoke of middle-class comfort without excessive wealth. They entered through the kitchen door where Margaret Cutler was waiting, exhausted and desperate. When she saw Abigail, Margaret's face showed confusion and fear and hope all mixed together. Her husband was bringing a black girl accused of witchcraft into their home to treat their son. It violated everything she'd been taught about proper society. But her son was dying and proper society hadn't saved him. She led Abigail upstairs without speaking. The boy lay in a bed soaked with sweat despite the cool night air. He was small for 9 years old, thin and pale, his breathing shallow and labored. The fever radiated off him in waves. His eyes were closed, but moving rapidly beneath the lids, trapped in fever dreams that were probably worse than his waking reality. Abigail removed the ropes from her wrists, needing full mobility to work. She approached the bed and placed her palm on the boy's forehead, feeling not just temperature but something deeper, the rhythm of his blood, the pattern of his breathing, the way his body was fighting a battle it was slowly losing. She confirmed what she'd told Cutler weeks earlier. Advanced malaria. The parasite had established itself in his blood, multiplying with each cycle, destroying red blood cells faster than his body could replace them. Left untreated, he had maybe 2 weeks before organ failure. But it was treatable if you knew what to use and how to use it. From the cloth bundle she'd been allowed to bring, Abigail removed packets of dried herbs she prepared months ago. Cinchona bark, the source of quinine, gathered from a trader who brought it up from South America. Artemisia annua, sweet wormwood, whose antimalarial properties had been known in China for thousands of years, but were still being discovered by Western medicine. Other plants whose names existed only in the old languages, passed down through generations of healers who'd learned through observation and necessity rather than formal study. She mixed them with water Margaret provided, creating a bitter tea that smelled like earth and medicine and hope. The boy was too weak to drink on his own, so Margaret supported his head while Abigail poured the mixture into his mouth slowly, waiting for him to swallow. Being patient when he gagged or coughed, it took nearly 20 minutes to get the full dose into him, but Abigail knew from experience that every drop mattered. Then came the next phase. She placed stones that had been heated on the stove along his spine, positioned precisely where nerves connected to organs, where heat could stimulate the body's own healing responses. She massaged pressure points on his wrists and ankles, places where blood vessels ran close to the surface, where you could influence circulation with the right amount of pressure applied in the right way. And she spoke the words, the same ones she'd used with Thomas Greaves, the same ones Mama Zena had taught her, passed down through so many generations that their original meaning had been lost, but their power remained. They weren't quite prayer and weren't quite incantation. They were something older, something that preceded the distinction between science and spirituality, between medicine and magic. Cutler and Margaret watched from the doorway, fascinated and frightened by what they were witnessing. Their son was being treated by methods their culture had dismissed as primitive superstition. They were trusting his life to a 17-year-old black girl who'd been arrested for witchcraft. Everything they'd been taught said this was wrong, dangerous, probably evil. But their son's fever was breaking. They could see it happening. Sweat poured off him as his body purged the infection. His breathing deepened. Color returned slowly to his face. The rigid tension in his muscles began to relax. For an hour, Abigail worked with total focus. When she finally finished, the boy was sleeping peacefully for the first time in weeks. His forehead was cool to the touch. His breathing was steady and strong. He looked like a child again instead of a dying patient. Abigail prepared additional packets of the herbal mixture and gave Margaret precise instructions. 3 times a day for a week, exact proportions. The boy needed rest. No exertion, Just sleep and medicine and time for his body to finish healing. If Margaret followed those instructions, he'd recover fully. If she didn't, the malaria would return and probably kill him. Margaret took the packets with trembling hands, looking at Abigail with an expression that held gratitude and guilt and confusion. This girl had saved her son. The same girl would stand trial in 2 days, accused of crimes that carried a death sentence. The contradiction was too large to process. Abigail looked at Cutler and reminded him of their agreement. She'd kept her end. Now he needed to keep his get-her exile instead of hanging. Let her leave Mississippi alive. Cutler nodded slowly. Something in his face had changed during the past hour. He still believed black people were inferior. He still thought the racial order was natural and necessary. But he'd watched a 17-year-old black girl do something his white doctors couldn't do. He'd seen her save his son with knowledge and skill that challenged everything he thought he knew about racial hierarchy. He said he'd honor the deal. He still thought she was dangerous, still believed black people shouldn't have the kind of power she possessed. But he wasn't an idiot. She'd saved his son when nobody else could. That meant something, even if he didn't want it to. They took Abigail back to her cell, the guard locking her in as if she'd never left. She settled into the darkness, exhausted but satisfied. She'd done the right thing. She'd helped a child who needed help, regardless of who his father was or what his father represented. That was what the gift demanded. That was what Mama Zena would have done. 2 days later, on June 5, 1871, Abigail's trial began. The courthouse was packed with spectators, white people filling every available seat, while black people stood outside, not allowed to enter, but needing to be present anyway. The air inside was thick with heat and tension. Judge William Morrison presided. A heavy man of 60, with a face like weathered leather and eyes that had seen too many injustices to pretend anymore that justice existed. The charges were read formally: practicing medicine without license, engaging in witchcraft and conjuring, inciting unrest among the Negro population, making terroristic threats against white citizens. Each charge carried serious penalties. Together they painted a picture of a dangerous individual who needed to be removed from society. The prosecution called witnesses. Edmund Hartwell testified that Abigail had disrupted his workforce by keeping laborers alive who should have died, creating expectations that black lives had value independent of their economic productivity. Reverend Marsh testified that she practiced dark arts that led people away from Christian faith, citing biblical passages that condemned sorcery. Several other white citizens testified about rumors they'd heard, creating a narrative of supernatural evil that had no basis, in fact, but sounded convincing when delivered under oath. Then Thomas Greaves was called to testify. He walked to the stand slowly, an old black man facing a courtroom full of white people who wanted him to condemn the girl who'd saved his life. The prosecutor asked him direct questions. Had Abigail Collins treated him when he was sick? Yes. Had she used unusual methods? Yes. Had she used unusual methods? Yes. Had those methods seemed like witchcraft? Thomas looked at the prosecutor, then at the judge, then at the crowd of white faces staring at him with expectation. He knew what they wanted him to say. He knew his life and his family's lives depended on him saying it. But he'd been a slave for 60 years before freedom came. And he'd learned that some things mattered more than survival. He said Abigail had healed him when he was dying. She'd used plants and prayers, same as root workers had been using since before any white person set foot in Mississippi. Was it witchcraft? He didn't know. All he knew was he'd been dying and now he was alive. If that was evil, then he'd take evil over the alternative. The courtroom erupted. Judge Morrison banged his gavel, calling for order. The prosecutor tried to redirect, asking more specific questions designed to make Thomas's testimony support their narrative. But Thomas wouldn't cooperate. He kept coming back to the simple truth. She'd healed him. That was all that mattered. When they finally let him step down, every black person outside the courthouse knew what he'd done. He'd risked everything to tell the truth. He'd refused to condemn the girl who'd saved him, even though that refusal might cost him dearly. The defense had no lawyer and no witnesses except Abigail herself. She was allowed to speak in her own defense, though everyone knew it wouldn't matter. The verdict was predetermined. This was theater, a show trial designed to demonstrate white authority over black defiance. But Abigail spoke anyway. She stood before the court and told her story clearly and without apology. She'd learned healing from Mama Zena, who'd learned from her grandmother, who'd learned from hers. Knowledge passed down through generations because enslaved people couldn't access formal education or white medicine. She'd used that knowledge to help people who were dying. She hadn't hurt anyone. She hadn't threatened anyone. She'd simply refused to let people die when she possessed the ability to save them. Was that witchcraft? She didn't think so, but if healing people made her a witch in their eyes, then every doctor was guilty of the same crime. The only difference was the color of the healer's skin and the source of their knowledge. She finished speaking and sat down. The courtroom was silent for a moment. Then Judge Morrison announced they would recess for deliberation, a formality since everyone knew the verdict had been decided before the trial started. They reconvened 2 hours later. Morrison read the verdict with the tone of a man performing an unpleasant duty. Guilty on all charges. The evidence was clear, the testimony compelling, the threat to public order undeniable. Abigail Collins had violated Mississippi law through her practice of unauthorized medicine and her engagement in activities that constituted witchcraft under state statute. Then came the sentence, and this was where Sheriff Cutler's influence showed. Instead of hanging, Morrison sentenced Abigail to permanent exile. She was to be escorted immediately to the county line and released with a warning never to return to Mississippi. If she ever set foot in Wilkinson County again, she would be arrested and executed without trial. The sentence was final and not subject to appeal. It should have been over. Abigail should have been taken away that same day, escorted north into Louisiana, or west into different parts of Mississippi where her reputation hadn't spread. She should have disappeared from Wilkinson County's history, remembered only in whispers and stories that would grow more distorted with each passing year. But the universe had different plans. That night, while Abigail sat in her cell waiting for morning in exile, something happened at the Hartwell Plantation that would change everything. Edmund Hartwell employed 40 black families as sharecroppers. Families trapped in debt that increased every year no matter how hard they worked. They lived in cabins that hadn't been repaired since slavery ended, structures with gaps in the walls and roofs that leaked. They worked from dawn to dusk during planting and harvest seasons, their labor making Hartwell wealthy while they stayed perpetually poor. The evening of June 5th, several people in those cabins began feeling sick. Fever, chills, aching muscles. They assumed it was exhaustion, the normal toll of brutal labor. They went to bed expecting to feel better by morning, but by dawn on June 6th, 20 people were seriously ill. By noon, the number had reached 30. By evening, 45 people were suffering from fever so severe they couldn't work, couldn't stand, could barely breathe. Children screamed in delirium. Adults vomited until nothing came up but bile. Old people lay motionless, their breathing so shallow they seemed already dead. Hartwell sent for the doctor, a white man named Preston, who serviced the county's white population and occasionally treated black people when their owners paid enough. Preston arrived, examined several patients, and delivered his diagnosis with the detachment of someone discussing livestock rather than humans. Typhoid fever, probably from contaminated water, though the source was less important than the implications. Typhoid spread fast in crowded conditions with poor sanitation, which described the sharecropper cabins perfectly. Without proper treatment, mortality could reach 30 or 40%. Even with treatment, people would die. Preston said he'd do what he could, but his resources were limited. He had some medicine, but not enough for 45 people. He could treat maybe 10, prioritizing those most likely to survive. The rest would have to rely on prayer and luck, neither of which had ever been reliable for black people in Mississippi. Hartwell exploded in rage. These were his workers. If they died, he'd lose the entire season. Cotton wouldn't harvest itself. He needed them alive, needed them healthy enough to work. Price wasn't an issue. He'd pay whatever Preston charged. Just save enough of them to bring in the harvest. But Preston couldn't save them. He didn't have the medicine. He didn't have the knowledge. Typhoid was complicated. Treatment was difficult. And honestly, he'd never been particularly successful with black patients anyway. Something about their constitution, he suggested with the casual racism of his time, made them respond differently to standard treatments. By June 7th, 3 people had died, 2 children and an elderly woman. By June 8th, the death toll reached 7. Panic spread through the sharecropper community. They were dying and no one was helping. The white doctor was useless. Their prayers went unanswered. They were trapped watching their families die, powerless to stop it. Then someone said Abigail's name. It started as a whisper, one person to another, spreading through the sick cabins like the disease itself. Abigail Collins could help. She'd healed dysentery, malaria, infected wounds, difficult childbirths. Surely she could heal this too. She had the knowledge. She had the gift. She was their only hope. But Abigail was in jail, sentenced to exile, scheduled to be removed from the county that very morning. By the time dawn broke on June 8th, she should have been gone, escorted across the county line and released with threats ringing in her ears. Except something happened that no one expected. A delegation of black people, 20 strong, appeared at the courthouse at dawn. They carried what money they'd been able to gather, a pitiful amount compared to what white people possessed, but significant for families who had almost nothing. They demanded to see Judge Morrison. Morrison, annoyed at being disturbed so early, agreed to meet them on the courthouse steps. They explained the situation. 45 people sick with typhoid, 7 already dead, more dying every hour. The white doctor was useless. Abigail Collins was their only hope. They were begging, literally begging, for permission to bring her to the plantation to treat the sick before more people died. Morrison's response was immediate and absolute. No. Abigail Collins had been convicted and sentenced. The law had spoken. She would not be allowed to practice her witchcraft, even to save lives. If black people were dying, that was unfortunate, but it didn't justify violating the court's decision. Besides, she'd been sentenced to exile precisely to prevent her from continuing these activities, the delegation pleaded. Children were dying, mothers were dying. Good people who'd never hurt anyone were suffering while they had the means to help them locked in a basement cell. What kind of justice condemned people to death for the crime of being black? Morrison told them to leave before he had them arrested for disturbing the peace. The decision was final. Abigail Collins would be exiled as ordered. If black people died in the meantime, that was God's will, not his responsibility. The delegation left, but they didn't give up. They went to Sheriff Cutler, reminding him that Abigail had saved his son. They went to Reverend Marsh, appealing to Christian charity. They went to Edmund Hartwell himself, pointing out that he'd lose his entire workforce if the epidemic wasn't stopped, and it was Hartwell who finally broke the deadlock. Though not for humanitarian reasons, he calculated quickly. 40 black workers dead meant no harvest. No harvest meant financial loss he couldn't afford. His plantation was mortgaged. Banks were unsympathetic to excuses. If he couldn't deliver cotton, he'd lose everything. He needed those workers alive. And if the only way to keep them alive was to let a black witch doctor treat them, so be it. His pride was negotiable when money was at stake. Hartwell went to Judge Morrison with a proposition. Let Abigail Collins treat the sick workers under guard. Keep her in chains if necessary, watch her constantly, but let her use her knowledge to stop the epidemic before it destroyed his workforce. Once the crisis passed, exile her as planned. Everyone got what they wanted. The workers lived. Hartwell kept his plantation. The law was still enforced, just with a brief practical exception. Morrison was trapped by the logic. Hartwell was powerful, one of the men who'd put Morrison on the bench, and the situation was genuinely desperate. 7 people dead already, more dying every hour. If the entire black workforce of one of the county's largest plantations was wiped out, the economic consequences would be severe. He agreed, but with conditions. Abigail would be guarded at all times by armed deputies. She would be in chains while treating patients. She would not be allowed to speak to anyone except when giving medical instructions, and the moment the crisis ended, she would be exiled immediately with no delays or exceptions. They brought Abigail from her cell on the morning of June 8th. She'd been preparing for exile, for leaving everything behind and starting over. Instead, she was being taken to the Hartwell plantation, to the place owned by the man who'd filed charges against her to treat the people whose lives he valued only as economic assets. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. The witch they tried to eliminate was now being begged to use her powers. The knowledge they'd called evil was suddenly necessary. The girl they'd condemned was now their last hope. When Abigail arrived at the plantation, the scene was worse than she'd imagined. 45 people sick and more showing symptoms every hour. 3 more had died overnight, bringing the total to 10. The cabins were crowded, hot, filled with the smell of sickness and fear. People lay on pallets, some unconscious, others moaning, a few just staring at nothing with the exhausted acceptance of people who'd stopped fighting. Dr. Preston was there, looking overwhelmed and useless. He'd done what he could, which wasn't much. He'd given out his limited supply of medicine. He'd offered advice about hydration and rest, and he'd mentally prepared himself for watching more people die, because that's what happened when typhoid hit populations with no resources and no real medical care. Abigail was led through the sick cabins in chains, her hands bound, 2 armed deputies following her constantly. She examined patients quickly, her experienced eye assessing severity, making mental calculations about who needed treatment first. She identified the source of contamination within 20 minutes, a well that had been built too close to the latrines, creating exactly the kind of bacterial transmission that caused typhoid. She told them to close the well immediately, warned everyone to boil water before drinking, and explained exactly how the disease was spreading. The white people present looked skeptical. A black girl in chains was lecturing them about sanitation and disease transmission, but they were desperate enough to listen. Then Abigail made her demands. And this was where everything could have fallen apart. She needed her hands free. She couldn't work in chains. She needed access to her supplies, the herbs and medicines in her shack. She needed clean water, lots of it, and she needed people to help her, black people who knew the patients and could follow her instructions. Hartwell agreed to everything, calculating that chains didn't matter as she saved his workforce. The deputies unlocked her restraints reluctantly. Someone was sent to her shack to retrieve her supplies. People brought buckets of clean water from a well farther from the cabins, and several black women who'd avoided infection volunteered to help. For the next 48 hours, Abigail didn't sleep. She moved from cabin to cabin, treating patients with medicines the white doctor had never heard of. Herbs that reduced fever and killed bacteria, teas that rehydrated the body and restored electrolyte balance, picases that drew out infection, techniques passed down through generations of healers who'd learned through necessity because formal medicine wasn't available to them. She taught the women, helping her exactly what to do, how much medicine to give and when, how to recognize dangerous symptoms, how to position patients so they could breathe easier, how to keep them clean and comfortable when they couldn't move. She created an organized system of care that was more effective than anything Dr. Preston had attempted, and people started recovering. The fever broke, the vomiting stopped, color returned to faces that had been gray with illness. Children who'd been delirious became lucid. Adults who couldn't stand began sitting up, then walking. By June 10th, 40 of the 45 patients were clearly improving. By June 11th, 35 were well enough to move around. By June 12th, no one else had died. The epidemic was over. Abigail Collins had done what the white doctor couldn't do. She'd stopped a typhoid outbreak using knowledge that white medicine dismissed as primitive superstition. The black community was jubilant. She'd saved them again, proven again that black knowledge was real and valuable. The white establishment was uncomfortable. They'd needed her. They'd literally begged her to use the powers they'd convicted her for using. The contradiction was glaring and impossible to ignore. Edmund Hartwell was relieved. His workforce would survive. His harvest would happen. His financial disaster had been averted. He felt gratitude. But it was the kind of gratitude that made him angry because it implied dependence. He needed help from a black girl that was humiliating in ways he didn't want to examine. On the evening of June 12th, Hartwell called Abigail to the big house. She came still exhausted, her clothes stained with sickness, her eyes red from lack of sleep. Hartwell sat on his porch, looking at this 17-year-old girl who'd saved everything he owned and struggled with what to say. He thanked her stiffly, uncomfortably, but genuinely. She'd done what he couldn't have done. She'd saved lives he'd needed saved. He wanted her to know he appreciated it, even if accepting that appreciation meant acknowledging things he didn't want to acknowledge. Then he told her it changed nothing. The law had spoken. She was still sentenced to exile. Tomorrow morning, she'd be escorted to the county line and released. She could never return to Mississippi. If she did, she'd be arrested and executed. Those were the terms. Gratitude didn't override justice, even when justice was obviously unjust. Abigail looked at him for a long moment. Then she said something that would be repeated for generations. Words that captured everything about her situation and the impossible position she'd been forced into. She said she'd healed his workers not because she expected gratitude or payment or even freedom. She'd done it because they needed help, and she could provide it. That was what the gift demanded. That was what being human required. Regardless of what color your skin happened to be or what laws tried to control what you could and couldn't do, but she wanted him to remember something. Every time he looked at his healthy workers, every time he counted his money from cotton they harvested, every time he slept well knowing his plantation was profitable, he should remember who'd made that possible. A 17-year-old black girl who possessed knowledge he'd tried to destroy and power he couldn't control, even with laws and guns and the entire weight of white supremacy behind him. She'd proven that black people had value beyond their labor. She'd demonstrated that black knowledge was equal or superior to white medicine. She'd shown that racial hierarchy was a lie maintained through violence, rather than an inevitable truth ordained by God or nature. He could exile her, he could threaten her with death if she returned, but he couldn't erase what she'd done or what she represented. Somewhere else, in some other place, she'd do the same thing. She'd heal people. She'd challenge authority. She'd prove that power didn't belong exclusively to white people. And eventually people like her would be everywhere. Black people who refused to be small, who possessed skills and knowledge that couldn't be denied, who demonstrated that equality wasn't a gift to be granted, but a truth that had always existed, despite centuries of lies saying otherwise. Hartwell had no response. What could he say? She was right. Everything she'd said was true. He dismissed her with a wave of his hand, uncomfortable with the way she'd made him feel. The next morning, June 13, 1871, Abigail Collins was escorted to the Wilkinson County line by Sheriff Cutler and 2 deputies. They rode north through territory she'd known her entire life, past fields she'd walked, past cabins where she'd healed people, past the swamp where she'd gathered medicines under moonlight. At the county line, Cutler removed her restraints and delivered the official warning. She was exiled permanently. She could never return to Mississippi. If she was seen anywhere in Wilkinson County again, she'd be arrested and executed immediately without trial. He advised her to go far away, somewhere her reputation hadn't reached, somewhere she could start fresh and maybe stay invisible this time. But then Cutler added something personal. His son had made a full recovery. The boy was healthy, back to normal, playing and eating and showing no signs of malaria. Preston had been amazed, said it was remarkable. Margaret wanted Cutler to thank Abigail, though she'd been too embarrassed to come herself. Cutler said he still thought she was dangerous, still believed black people shouldn't have her kind of power, but he wasn't going to forget what she'd done, and he'd make sure his son knew when he was old enough to understand that a black girl had saved his life when white medicine had failed. Abigail nodded acknowledgement. Then she asked Cutler a question. Did he really believe the racial order was natural? Did he truly think white people were inherently superior because he'd seen evidence otherwise? He'd watched her save his son. He'd seen her stop an epidemic. He knew, even if he wouldn't admit it publicly, that black people possessed intelligence and ability equal to white people. So what happened now? Did he keep lying to himself? Did he keep enforcing laws he knew were unjust? Or did he start questioning the system he'd spent his life defending? She didn't wait for an answer. She simply turned and walked across the county line into Louisiana, leaving Cutler standing there with questions he didn't want to answer. Abigail Collins disappeared from official records after that day. No one knows for certain where she went or what happened to her. Some say she settled in New Orleans, working as a healer in the black community there. Others claim she went north to Chicago or Detroit, cities where black people could sometimes escape the worst of Southern racism. A few stories suggest she traveled west, ending up in California, where her knowledge was valued regardless of its source. What is certain is that she never returned to Wilkinson County. She kept that part of the bargain, but her legend remained, growing with each retelling. The witch who defied white authority. The healer who'd saved lives despite laws saying she shouldn't. The girl who'd proven that black power was real and couldn't be eliminated to exile or execution or any amount of racist legislation. For generations, black people in Mississippi told stories about Abigail Collins. Parents told children, grandparents told grandchildren. The details changed, got exaggerated, became more miraculous with distance, but the core truth remained. The 17-year-old black girl had possessed knowledge and power that white supremacy couldn't tolerate and couldn't destroy. Her story became part of the underground history, the version of events that black communities preserved because official history ignored or distorted their experiences. It became a reminder that resistance was possible, North's brewery, that black excellence was real, that the system designed to crush them couldn't eliminate everyone who challenged it. And it asked a question that echoed through time, just as relevant in 1871 as it would be 150 years later. Was Abigail Collins feared because she was genuinely dangerous? Or was she feared because a young black woman possessing that much knowledge, that much skill, that much undeniable power challenged the very foundation of a society built on the assumption of black inferiority? The answer, of course, was the latter. She was feared because she proved the lie. She demonstrated that black people weren't inherently inferior, that they possessed knowledge equal or superior to white knowledge in many domains, that racial hierarchy was maintained through violence and law rather than natural superiority. A black girl who could save lives when white doctors failed. who could stand up to sheriffs and judges, who could demand dignity and refuse invisibility that was more threatening than any weapon, that challenged everything white supremacy needed people to believe. So, they exiled her. But they couldn't erase what she'd proven. They couldn't undo the lives she'd saved or the precedent she'd set. They couldn't eliminate the possibility that other black people seeing her example might refuse to stay small and quiet and powerless. Abigail Collins was one girl in one county in one state, but her story represented something larger, the ongoing struggle of black people to claim the full humanity, respect, and power that had always been rightfully theirs, but had been denied through centuries of oppression. She was called a witch in 1871 Mississippi. But maybe the real witchcraft was the system that tried to make black excellence invisible, that punished black knowledge, that called healing evil when it came from black hands. Maybe the real evil wasn't the girl who saved lives. Maybe it was the people who'd rather let children die than admit a black person could do something they couldn't. That question posed by Abigail's story remains relevant today. How much of what we call order is actually organized injustice? How much of what we call natural hierarchy is actually maintained through systematic violence? How many people with knowledge and skill and power have been silenced because that knowledge and skill and power challenged those who needed them to remain powerless? Abigail Collins answered those questions in 1871 by refusing to be silent, by using her gift despite the danger, by saving lives when the system said those lives didn't matter. Her answer cost her everything: her home, her community, her place in the world. But it also proved something that couldn't be disproven. Black power was real. Black knowledge was valuable. Black lives mattered not because white society granted them value, but because they possessed inherent worth that existed independent of recognition or permission. That was Abigail's legacy, not the specific medicine she used or the particular people she saved, but the undeniable demonstration that a young black woman in Mississippi in 1871 could possess power that white supremacy couldn't eliminate no matter how hard it tried. She lived, she healed, she challenged authority, and she survived to disappear into history, leaving behind a legend that would inspire generations of black people who heard her story and understood its message. You don't have to accept powerlessness. You don't have to stay small and quiet and invisible. You can use whatever gifts you possess to help your community, to challenge injustice, to prove that the hierarchy that oppresses you is built on lies rather than truth. And even if they exile you, even if they threaten you with death, even if they use every tool of oppression to silence you, you'll have proven something that can never be erased. That you existed, that you mattered, that you possessed power they couldn't destroy. That was Abigail Collins, the girl they called a witch because a young black woman with knowledge and power was more terrifying than any supernatural evil they could imagine. She was feared not because she was dangerous to people's lives, but because she was dangerous to the lie that white supremacy depended on. The lie that black people were inferior, the lie that their knowledge was primitive, the lie that they deserved to be controlled and contained and kept powerless. Abigail proved the lie, and for that, she became a witch in the eyes of those who needed the lie to be true. But to the people she saved, to the communities who preserved her story, to the generations who heard her name and understood what it represented, she was something else entirely. She was a healer, a hero, a reminder that black power was real and had always been real, regardless of how much violence and law and social pressure was used to deny it. And she was proof that even in Mississippi in 1871, at the height of white supremacy's power, one 17-year-old black girl could challenge the entire system and survive to tell the tale. That was her magic. That was her witchcraft. Not potions or spells or supernatural evil, but the revolutionary act of being undeniably excellent in a society that needed her to fail. She didn't fail. She succeeded. And that success, more than anything else, was